Welcome to our discussion on intelligence. And let us first, as we always do, define what psychologists mean when we're talking about intelligence. And that is the capacity to learn from your experience and adapt successfully to your environment. It's a nice general definition that encompasses a lot of different viewpoints on, on intelligence. And it has a little bit of a, as you can see in the definition, adapt successfully to your environment and learn from your experience. That sounds very almost Darwinian, and in that it sounds like a survival of the fittest, natural selection sort of deal. But that's sort of what that really nicely encompasses the way that a lot of intelligence researchers think of intelligence, that um, animals and people who are able to learn from their past experiences, right, not make the same mistakes twice, and also um, adapt successfully to changes in your environment are the ones that are most, we would say, are most suitable to um, survive and and in Darwinian terms, pass on your genes to the next generation and so on. But we'll talk more. We'll talk more about other viewpoints, other schools of thought in terms of the nature of intelligence, what intelligence actually is, a little later. But let's first start out with talking about how we measure intelligence. And intelligence tests. We want to start talking about a guy named Galton from the late 1800s. He was the cousin of Charles Darwin, as it turns out. And Galton is notable for a couple things. One is that he was one of the earliest people to talk about the link between genetics and intelligence. So he says there's a genetic link. And it turns out he was right, quite right about that. Although the way that he got to that answer is a little uh, uh, squirrely, a little weird. And it wasn't until much later that sort of more contemporary intelligence research has established that strong genetic link with more sophisticated scientific methods. But the way that Galton came to that conclusion was he said, Charles Darwin is a genius, is sort of laying out his logical argument, and everybody would agree with that. And uh, and I'm a genius. Galton's saying that about himself, and he said, and we're related, right? He's my cousin, so genius must run in the family, right? Intelligence must run in the family, and so therefore be hereditary or genetically linked. And so he was right about it, but the way that he showed his work, so to speak, and coming to that answer was a little dubious. Another thing that he is also known for, he has the dubious distinction of being an early advocate of eugenics. And eugenics, if you're not familiar with that, is the idea that only certain people should be allowed to procreate, to have uh, children, and people who so only people who have desirable characteristics and who don't have any diseases or ailments or any you know, and maybe only people who are of a certain intelligence should be allowed to procreate, and everybody else should be sterilized so that they can't have kids. Um, and of course, that's an idea that uh, essentially is extremely unpopular among most civilized societies. And but Galton was he thought that was a good idea. Now, moving forward a little bit from the late 1800s to early 1900s, in France there was a researcher named Binet, who was commissioned by the French government to come up with a test to identify special needs children in France, in the school system. And he did. He came up with this nice test, intelligence test, and it had a couple sort of two main components: a verbal component and a performance component, and measuring different types of abilities within each, and was quite successful and did very well, and became the basis for what we today still use as one of the most popular measures of intelligence. In around that time, in the early, like I said, early 1900s, there was a researcher, a psychologist at Stanford University named Terman. And I'm going to move forward here for a second. There's our buddy Binet, Alfred Binet, looking very dapper. And then we've got Louis Terman, who's at Stanford. He heard about this test and was really interested in it, and it had brought over to the U.S. and translated from French to English. And so the English version, right, is now at that time and since then has been called the Stanford Binet Intelligence Test. And Terman, so he's notable for that. And also a second thing is he popularized the concept of intelligence quotient. He was an advocate of this idea. He said that this is a really a simple number that would be an easy way for comparing people in terms of their intelligence. And the IQ, this idea of IQ, if you look on this slide here, intelligence quotient can be derived with this simple formula on the bottom: mental age divided by chronological age times 100. So first, okay, we all know what chronological age is. It's your actual age. Mental age is, as we have it defined up here on the top of the slide, right? It's a measure of the level, the intellectual level, developmental level on which you're functioning. So someone who has a mental age of 8 years, what that means is you can successfully complete the same types of intellectual tasks as the average 8-year-old child. So to establish mental age, what Binet had to do and Terman did and other researchers, you give it this test out to people of all different ages, right? And then what you do is for each age, you find out what is the average sort of the score for each age, and that becomes the mental age in terms of that particular score. The score is associated with a particular age group. So let's say, for example, that you're 10 years old and you get a particular score on the test, on this Stanford Binet test, and the particular score that you get is the same that most 12-year-olds get, right? So we would say that your mental age is 12, but yet your chronological age is only 10. So you can see that 12 divided by 10 times 100, and that gives you your IQ. Now, so essentially, and I should say the average IQ on the Stanford Binet and a bunch of other mainstream intelligence tests is 100. That's the average score. So let's actually move ahead for a second. I'm going to come back to talking about these, but this is from the WAIS, and we'll talk about the WAIS in a moment. But this is generally also how the Stanford Binet is divided up into two separate components. There's a verbal component, which has a bunch of subtests, like the general information and similarities and so on. And then there's a performance component, which has also a bunch of tests, subtests, and those are timed. And then you get your scores and for each, and that brings you to your overall IQ score. Now, this is the thing I want to show you for a second. Now, this is for Wechsler, but also applies to Stanford-Binet. There's another one called the Woodcock-Johnson, and a few other ones that current intelligence test researchers. But the big ones are the WAIS, right? The Wechsler Intelligence Scales, and the Stanford-Binet. Now, you can see what's interesting is you can see on this distribution, this is a sort of an average distribution of IQ scores in the general population. Wechsler's intelligence scores, right? So you see right in the middle of that bell curve is 100, right? That's the average IQ score. And they go up by, as you can see on the x-axis here, by 15 points. Those are what we call standard deviations. And those are the meaningful jumps in scores. So if we go up from 100, there are, and it differs sometimes, it depends on what textbook you're reading and the sort of the nomenclature that they use, but they'll go from, still it'll be called average, above average, superior, very superior, and gifted, and so on. And if I'm not mistaken, very superior is around starts at 130. And then 145 would be in the gifted range, 145 and above. When you going backwards, they have different terminologies. I believe at 70, if I recall correctly, is when they would have a designation of what used to be called mental retardation, but I think they call it developmentally delayed. And they have sort of gradations of that as you go down from sort of mild, moderate, severe, and so on. So let's go back to talking about these Wechsler scales, which are also very popular and in usage today, just like the Stanford-Binet. And I just have a few up here. The interesting thing about the Wechsler scales is they're divided up. There's different scales depending on the age of the person. Now, Stanford-Binet is doesn't have necessarily that designation. But the Wechsler scales, for example, the WAIS stands for the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, used for adults. So this would be basically anyone 18 and older. The WISC is the Wechsler Intelligence Scale for children. That'd be ages, I want to say 5 to 17. And then the Wechsler Preschool and Primary Scale of Intelligence would be from the very, very youngest to age 5, right? The little toddlers. Now the Wechsler scales are basically comprised and constructed just like the Stanford-Binet tests. As I showed you here, this is some sample items from the WAIS. Now, interesting, I'm going to mention a couple things about the tests, and again, these are similar to Stanford-Binet. That on the verbal section, there are right and wrong answers. And so you write down the person's answer or record it verbatim. And if they correct themselves, oh, wait, I meant to say this, you have to take the answer that they first gave, even if they later corrected themselves. And there's a code book, a scoring book, and you get perfectly worded, correctly worded answers. Like, for example, why do people buy fire insurance, right? And there's a certain answer that will get you 2 points. It's the best answer. You have to phrase it almost identically to how it is in the scorebook. There's a 1 point answer, which means that you kind of got it. You're in the ballpark, but you don't actually have it phrased quite correctly. And then there's a 0 point, which means you just gave a completely wrong answer. And the other thing I want to mention about the performance section is that, as I mentioned earlier, these are all, most of them, I should say, are timed. So that you have to not only get the correct answer, but you have to get the answer quickly. And so the amount of points you get for solving each problem depends on how many seconds you took to solve it. In addition to, of course, actually having the right answer. Okay, a couple more things. Just wanted to show you. On the bottom, interestingly enough, the SAT scores map almost identically to Wechsler scores in terms of distribution. Right, so an average SAT score would be 500. If you look on this and map it up to the top, a score of 600 on one of the subtests on the SAT would be, so it says math or verbal, right? So let's just say math. Score of 600 is equal to 115 IQ. Score of 700 is equal to 130, right? IQ. Now, it's not saying that, I should say that that's not saying that if you get a math or a verbal SAT with 700, that means that you have 130 IQ. It doesn't mean that at all. We're just saying that it's sort of roughly mapping onto, akin to that level of, in terms of frequency and the distribution in the general population. Here's just something that, and I'm not going to ask you to know all these numbers or, but I wanted to just show this just to sort of illustrate again how strong the genetic component is in terms of IQ and intelligence. If you look at the top, okay, so start with the top one, identical twins reared together. That means that they have the same genetics and the same environment. Correlation between those two twins' scores on an intelligence test, 0.86. Really, really high. Now, what's interesting, though, if you look at the next one, identical twins reared apart. So here they have the same genetics, but they have completely different learning histories, different environmental background, and so on. They still have an extremely high correlation of 0.72. That means that the 0.72 would basically essentially mean that that is the genetic contribution itself. And so what we're saying is that their scores are correlated 0.72 simply because of genetics. And that is a huge contribution to that ability, that characteristic in terms of genetic contribution. Okay. This is just a simple slide showing that intelligence scores are less correlated as you're younger, simply because you're learning and you're growing and you're acquiring more information as you're younger, getting better educated. So the scores, right, between, for example, age 2 and age 9, not that high correlation. So what we're saying is the scores as you get older should have a stronger correlation because they're not going to deviate that much because you're done with your education and so on. So for example, between 30 and 43, you can see the correlation is a lot higher. And then definitely between 50 and 70, it's extremely high correlation. Basically, your IQ is generally not moving up dramatically. Okay, now group aptitude tests. An aptitude test, you may have taken some in high school for trying to determine, what your aptitude is for a particular job. Let's say, are you well suited to be a stockbroker or salesperson or a lawyer, right? That's kind of not necessarily what we're talking about in this section. What we're talking about are tests that are designed to predict how well you will do in a particular setting, like the SAT for college, GRE for grad school, LSAT for law school, MCAT for med school, and so on. There's all kinds of these general tests, right? And the whole thing with these types of tests they're designed to predict how well generally the person should do in those settings. That's why these places use them as a barrier for entry, right? And the way that they've established that is that they have looked at earlier groups who've taken them, they've tracked them and they tested to see how well they've got the data on how well they actually did in college or grad school or law school. And then they went back and correlated it with the particular scores, right? So they perhaps they found, like with SAT scores or GREs, that scores of I don't know, 1,200 verbal, quantitative combined. It might mean that the person tends to do pretty well in college or grad school, and certain percentage of likelihood to graduate, and get certain types of grades and so on. And that's what they're concerned with, right? The admissions committees. Are IQ tests valid? And the short answer is depends on what you're trying to use the IQ test for, right? Are you trying? So IQ tests or intelligence tests, generally speaking, what they're designed to, what they're best able at predicting is how well you will do in an academic setting, unfortunately. Right, so if you get a high IQ or good score on intelligence tests, it doesn't necessarily have a strong correlation to how well you'll do in life, how happy you'll be, how financially successful you'll be. It has fairly low correlation on those points, but it's quite highly predictive or correlated with whether or not you're going to be successful in an academic setting. So it's got limited validity in terms of what you could use those for. Are they biased? And the answer is yes. Short answer is yes. And a test is biased if the test, when it's normed, right, when you create the test, and the group that you use to have to come up with what is a normative response, right? What's the normal response? Your sort of baseline group is not representative of the population that you're then subsequently going to be testing, right? So, for example, if you have let's say you have a test that you only give to women, then it wouldn't be representative of perhaps of how men would do on that test. And with IQ tests, oddly enough, a lot of them were normed on, Caucasian students who were middle to middle to upper middle socioeconomic status. So they had different types of a different kind of cultural. They have a specific kind of cultural background and a different type of educational background, probably more. I want to say rich, but they had better materials, more educational materials to learn from, more up-to-date materials, and so on. Exposure to a wider variety of things and experiences in their education, compared to students who were not, who lived in maybe more socioeconomically disadvantaged backgrounds. They wouldn't have that kind of background and exposure. So if you've got that as your baseline, saying, okay, this is what's normal, then you've automatically built into the test a bias. And most researchers today would say that agree that is why most of these are biased. For a long time, and this is a thing that's actually still, I don't have the most recent data on it, but for decades and decades, it was always the case that you get a different discrepancy, usually 10 to 15 point discrepancy between racial groups. Asians would do better, they do best on IQ tests. European Americans or Europeans, right? Or Caucasians would do somewhere in the middle, right? They would be 15 points lower, and then African Americans or other minorities would do 10 to 15 points lower than Caucasians. And the question is why? And some people thought that was due to some racial differences in, in terms of differences in terms of your brains, which has of course been debunked. It's not true. Or some other types of differences, but having it be racially based. And it's not true. The reason why there's that difference, most researchers agree, is that because of the cultural differences between the groups and exposure to different types of educational materials. So again, sort of the short answer, and again, I don't want to get too far into the weeds on that discussion. But the short answer is yes, they're biased. There was back in the 70s a show called Good Times. It was a sitcom about an African American family living in Chicago and the projects. They're fairly poor, but it was it was a funny program, and about a family, and they're trying to make their ends meet and so on. And here's a picture of the family. And on the left, you have their youngest son, Michael. And I should mention, everybody in this picture is from the family, except the woman in the very middle in the back. She's their neighbor. So, your mom and dad and two teenage boy and girl, and then the youngest son on the left, Michael. And Michael was the one in the family that was the sort of the little genius. He was always getting straight A's, and he comes home one day and he's really upset. And the parents ask, why is that? And it's because they gave out IQ tests or intelligence tests, and he didn't do very well. And he really was sort of rocked his world, because it's like, I'm getting all A's, and how can this be? And does it mean I'm really not smart? And parents they were looking at this test that he took, and they got the suspicion that this test is biased. It's assuming a background that he was not exposed to. And at that time, there was it turns out, an African American psychologist who had done some research on the bias of these tests, and wanted to make this point, and he came up with a slightly tongue-in-cheek version of an IQ test that would favor African Americans only, and not, and if you were from a different race or a different background, cultural background, or socioeconomic status, right? So there's urban African Americans who are more socioeconomically poor than Caucasians coming from maybe a richer educational background. That you wouldn't, if you were from these sort of a different cultural background, you were not going to do well on this test. And he called it the Bitch test, Robert Williams, 1972. The Black Intelligence Test of Cultural Heritage. And so the parents take this test to the principal, who is white, and they're saying, let's see how you can do on this test. And they rattle off a bunch of questions, and of course he fails miserably on all of them. I think one of the items was, what does TCB stand for? And they give him a bunch of choices, and of course he failed it. And then I think the correct answer was taking care of business. Right, and again, it's not meant to be an official, intelligence test. It's trying to make the point that if you assume a certain set of a shared particular background or cultural background in the way that you set up the test, then you're building that bias into the test, and people who don't come from that background are inherently not going to do very well, right? No matter what their situation is. So, and they persuaded him to take that that intelligence tests out of the curriculum, and all was right with the world at the end of the episode. But so the reason I bring that whole thing up is because that there is, and most researchers agree, there is that bias built into these tests, unfortunately, which explains which and future intelligence tests have to be aware of that when you're creating not only intelligence tests but any kind of psychological tests. You have to do a really thorough, good job of making sure that your norms, your normative sampling is representative of the population that you want to generalize it to. Okay, now let's talk a little bit about what is intelligence. A lot of discussion over the decades about this. As you can see, going all the way back to 1904 with Spearman. And one of the first approaches is this idea of general intelligence, or G. And what this idea is just simply the idea that if you're intelligent in one area of life, right, then you're going to be intelligent in all areas of your life. That there's just one number, one type of intelligence that covers everything. So there is some evidence for that, but most researchers disagree with the idea of this just one type of general intelligence, what we might call information processing intelligence or book learning or academic intelligence. That's not necessarily the case. Other researchers, like Gardner, says that there are 7 types of intelligence. That's my personal favorite model because it gives equal weight to all these different ways of looking at intelligence. Like someone who knows 7 languages or multiple languages, shouldn't that be a type of intelligence that we could respect just as equally as being able to, solve math problems and logic problems? I think so. Someone who can play musical instruments, right? Someone who who's a great athlete. Shouldn't that be a type of intelligence, right? Your athletic ability. So, and you'll see this in some of his, and you don't have to write all this down. You can write down whatever you want in terms of the definition, but you should know the 7 types. So musical, body kinesthetic, right? Your orientation of your body, dancers, athletes, surgeons. Intrapersonal is understanding yourself, right? You want to, if you're going to, for example, get into a relationship with someone, you'd like it to be the case that that your partner is able to understand their self and be insightful, right? That'd be nice. Interpersonal, as you can see, very crucial. This is basically understanding other people's, let's say, body language and other people's feelings, and being attuned to them. And of course, that's crucial for people like who are salespeople, politicians, obviously psychotherapists, teachers. And then our last 3 in the Gardner's 7, linguistic, right? I mentioned that earlier, knowing a bunch of different languages. Logical, mathematical. This is the classic way that we think of intelligence, like someone who can, do math problems, someone who can drive proofs, solve logical puzzles. This is sort of the academic type of intelligence. And then the last one is spatial. Your understanding your orientation in space, like architect, so thinking in terms of 3D, marine navigators, so on. A decent amount of evidence to support the Gardner approach. It's my personal favorite approach of the 3 that we're going to talk about. So we got Spearman's general, Gardner's 7, and last we've got Sternberg's 3. Sternberg is an extremely prominent, prolific researcher, and he was at Yale. I'm not sure if came back to Yale. He was at Yale for a long time. Then he went to be president of, I think, Nebraska, University of Nebraska, for a little while. And I'm not sure if he went back to Yale. I think he did. But in terms of in the research on intelligence, Sternberg is one of the top three, probably top five researchers in this area. And so this is his approach. He says there are three types of intelligence: information processing, which we just talked about. Then we've got creative intelligence, which also is a really, and maybe you could put some of the ones that from Gardner's all meld them into creative. But creative, as it says, use your experience in ways that foster insight. So what creative is the way I like to think about it is seeing new connections between old areas, right? Putting stuff that we already know about, things that we already know about, but thinking about them in new ways. And that's usually where you get your scientific insights, the discoveries, things like that. And then last, practical intelligence, read and adapt to context in everyday life. The way I think of that is street smarts. Now, the way that you could talk about this is someone who's got practical intelligence. Let's say they get into they go start their new day at a new job, and someone who's got practical intelligence is going to be able to understand the politics of their new office, environment, right, that they're in at the new company. Probably within the first half hour or an hour, they're already going to be able to ascertain or understand the unwritten rules of how things are done at that company. So this is what I mean by street smarts. It's your ability to ascertain or quickly figure out what are the unwritten rules for this environment, this context, and ways to succeed. Who do I need to be friends with to succeed in this company corporate environment, and who do I want to avoid, and who do I want to align yourself with, and so on, and how is the quote unquote game played? Okay. And practical intelligence is extremely important. This you might think of this if you remember, go back to our definition of intelligence. It's the ability to learn from your experience, but also to adapt to changes in your environment successfully. And that's right in this definition right here. Ready to adapt to the context of your everyday life, these things. Okay. I think that is the end of our discussion. Sort of a shorter lecture. Hope you enjoyed it, and we'll see you at the next lecture.